"You're a fake." The word landed like a slap across the face of 23 million people watching live. Jean-Claude Van Damme was on his feet, white suit jacket catching every studio light. One finger extended across the couch, pointed directly at Bruce Lee, steady, deliberate, aimed like a weapon. The Tonight Show stage, NBC Studios, Burbank, California, 1982. Cameras rolling, audience frozen, the kind of silence a room full of 300 people should not be able to produce. Rodney Dangerfield sat behind his desk with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and his face doing something it had never done in 30 years of professional comedy. Nothing. His eyes moved between Van Damme and Bruce Lee the way a man watches two cars accelerating toward each other on a one-lane road, with the absolute, helpless certainty that he is not going to be the one who stops this. Van Damme's voice filled the studio, controlled, theatrical, the voice of a man who had been rehearsing this in his chest for years without knowing it. "Everything you do is choreography. I've been in real fights, real blood, real knockouts. What you do, that is a movie, and everyone in this building knows it." The audience did not applaud. They did not boo. They made the low, collective sound of 300 people simultaneously deciding they were not breathing until someone else did first. And Bruce Lee, the man the challenge was aimed at, did not stand, did not raise his voice, did not shift a single inch in his seat. He turned his head slowly, looked at Van Damme the way a surgeon looks at a scan he has already read 3 times, and then said nothing at all. That stillness, that complete, absolute, undisturbed stillness, was more unsettling than anything Van Damme had just said. 23 million people had just watched Jean-Claude Van Damme call Bruce Lee a fraud on national television, and the most dangerous man on that stage hadn't moved a muscle. But to understand what happened next, and why this story was buried for 20 years, you have to go back to the afternoon before a single camera went live. Because what happened in that green room changed everything that followed on that stage. Subscribe right now and do not move. What happens in the next 4 minutes has never been told the way it actually went down. Brussels, Belgium, 1970. Jean-Claude Van Damme is 11 years old, sitting in a dark theater watching Enter the Dragon for the 3rd time in the same week. Not for entertainment, for study. He watches the way other boys watch something they want to become, with hunger, with envy, and with the particular bitterness of someone who already knows they will spend their whole life being compared to the thing they are watching. He begins karate at 12. By 19, he has a Belgian karate championship, and a jaw that has been broken and reset and broken again, and a body that has absorbed the kind of punishment that convinces a young man of one dangerous thing, that the ability to endure pain is the only credential that actually counts. He arrives in Hollywood in 1979 with $400, a suitcase, and one belief carried across the Atlantic like a stone in his chest, that he was the real thing, and that the man the whole world had decided was the face of martial arts had never once been the real thing at all. The auditions begin. The comparisons begin with them. Casting directors, producers, studio executives who have never thrown a punch in their lives, sitting behind desks, asking him why he doesn't have what Bruce Lee had, why he doesn't move like Bruce Lee, why he doesn't carry the screen the way Bruce Lee carried it, as if Bruce Lee were a standard that real fighters were supposed to measure themselves against, rather than a man who made films. In 1982, Van Damme walks into a Hollywood audition and performs a full-contact demonstration that stops everyone in the room. 3 boards broken, a spinning heel kick that pulls within 2 inches of the camera lens without touching it. Raw, trained, legitimate power. The producer watching leans back in his chair when it's over and says, "Impressive, but you don't have what Bruce Lee had. That man was something different." Van Damme walks out of the building, sits in his car in the parking structure on Cahuenga Boulevard for 40 minutes without starting the engine. That sentence follows him out of the building, down the stairs, into the car, all the way home. He never forgets it, and he never forgives the man the sentence was about. NBC Studios, Burbank, California. A Tuesday evening in the fall of 1982. The Tonight Show is running a special celebrity edition that week, and Rodney Dangerfield is sitting in as guest host. A decision that made perfect sense to everyone in the programming department and absolutely no sense to anyone who understood what Rodney Dangerfield actually was. He was not a moderator. He was not a diplomat. He was a man who had built an entire career on the principle that discomfort, when properly applied, was the funniest thing in the world. Putting Rodney Dangerfield between two martial artists with unresolved grievances was not hosting a conversation. It was lighting a fuse and handing it to the audience. Van Damme had been booked first. He was promoting his debut Hollywood feature, a martial arts film that the studio believed would introduce him to mainstream American audiences the way Enter the Dragon had introduced Bruce Lee a decade earlier. The comparison was intentional. The marketing team had made it themselves. Nobody asked Van Damme how he felt about it. Bruce Lee was booked separately, appearing to discuss the continuing global reach of Jeet Kune Do, the martial philosophy he had built from the ground up, dismantling every traditional system he had ever studied and rebuilding it into something that belonged to no school, no lineage, no flag. An archival documentary was being released that month. The Tonight Show wanted him there to talk about legacy. Nobody in the production meeting connected the two bookings into a single problem. The green room that evening was divided into two waiting areas separated by a narrow corridor. Narrow enough that when Van Damme arrived 40 minutes before airtime and Bruce Lee arrived 20 minutes after, there was no architectural way to keep them from occupying the same 12 feet of space. Van Damme sees him first. Bruce Lee is sitting alone on a bench against the corridor wall. No publicist, no assistant, no one managing the temperature of his presence. Just a man in a black shirt with a paperback open across one knee and the complete self-contained stillness of someone who has never once needed a room to know he was in it. Van Damme sits down nearby, lets a beat pass, then says it. Easy, conversational, light enough to be deniable if the moment required it. I've seen your films. You move well for someone who's never been hit by someone actually trying to hurt you. Bruce Lee doesn't look up immediately. He finishes the sentence he is reading. Then he closes the book, turns, and looks at Van Damme with an expression that carries no heat in it whatsoever. And that absence of heat is the most threatening thing Van Damme has ever seen on a man's face. He says, I know exactly what you are. I've met you in every city I've ever been in. You fight to prove something. That's not fighting. That's begging. Then he opens his book again. A PA appears at the end of the corridor. Airtime in 8 minutes. Both men are needed on stage. Van Damme stands, smooths the front of his white jacket, and makes a decision in that corridor that has nothing to do with the interview anymore. If you've ever watched someone stay completely calm while someone else is trying to break them, you already know what's coming. Subscribe right now and don't move. The first 8 minutes of the segment are perfect television. Van Damme is charming, polished, effortlessly physical. He demonstrates a sidekick for Dangerfield that moves the air in the front row, and Dangerfield staggers backward in his chair with the exaggerated horror of a man auditioning for his own death scene. The audience loves it. Van Damme grins. He is good at this. He knows how to fill a room with his body and his energy and his easy European confidence. And for 8 minutes, the whole stage belongs entirely to him. Bruce Lee speaks when Dangerfield turns to him. Measured, precise. He talks about Jeet Kune Do not as a fighting system, but as a philosophy of self-knowledge. The idea that every style, every technique, every tradition is only a finger pointing at the moon, and the mistake is to stare at the finger. The audience listens with the polite attention people give to things they respect without fully understanding. Dangerfield nods, makes a joke about not being able to find the moon from New Jersey. The audience laughs. The segment breathes, and then Dangerfield, with the accidental genius of a man who has no instinct for danger, turns to Van Damme and asks the question that opens every door at once. So Jean-Claude, you've been in real competition, real fights, real contact. How does that compare to what we see up on the screen? Van Damme does not look at Dangerfield when he answers. He turns his body on the couch and faces Bruce Lee directly. The camera operator in position 2 feels it before he understands it and pushes in without being told. Van Damme begins measured, talking about the difference between choreography and combat, between a movement rehearsed 10,000 times in a studio and a movement produced under genuine physical pressure from a man who is genuinely trying to take you apart. Each sentence a step closer, each sentence tightening the perimeter around the man sitting 2 feet away from him. Then, with all due respect, and I mean this sincerely, what you see in a Bruce Lee film is beautiful. It is art. No one is disputing that. But you cannot be a legend of martial arts on the strength of cinema. Real fighters know the difference. The people in this room may not, but real fighters do. The audience murmurs. Not applause, not boos. The uncertain collective sound of 300 people who have just registered that something irreversible has been said, and are waiting to find out whether it was brave or catastrophic. Bruce Lee's response is 5 words, delivered without volume, without theater, without a single degree of visible emotion. You need an audience to feel it. The studio goes quieter than a room of 300 people has any right to go. Van Damme stands. The movement is controlled, deliberate, not aggressive but final, the way a man stands when he has decided the conversation is over, and what comes next is something else entirely. His finger comes up. The photograph that will exist forever is taken in this exact second. You're a fake, right here, right now. No cameras, no choreography, no wire work, no editing. Let's settle this the way it actually gets settled. Bruce Lee stands, not fast, not slow. He rises the way water rises, without urgency, without effort, without any visible awareness that 300 people and 23 million more have just stopped breathing in unison. He straightens the front of his black shirt. He looks at Van Damme across the 18 inches of charged air between them. And when he speaks, his voice is so quiet that the front row leans forward as one body to catch it. I'll show you one thing. Not a fight. I don't fight for audiences, but one thing. And after I show it to you, you decide what you'd like to do next. He steps forward, not back, forward, into Van Damme's space. And in that single step, something in the temperature of the room changes in a way that none of the 300 people present will ever be able to fully explain to the people who weren't there. The cameras kept rolling, and what they captured in the next 40 seconds is the reason this story was kept off the air for 20 years. What Bruce Lee did in those 40 seconds was not a strike. That is the first thing every person who is close enough to see it will tell you. And they will tell you it the way people tell you the thing that surprised them most, with a small shake of the head, as though they are still not entirely sure they have the right words for it. He closed the distance in a single movement. One step, one breath, one economy of motion so complete and so quiet that Van Damme, a man with genuine championship fights behind him, a man whose reflexes had been trained under conditions that would dismantle most human bodies, could not find an angle to respond. Not because he was too slow, because there was no angle. Because Bruce Lee had stepped into the one position a trained fighter cannot reach from, the one pocket of space inside Van Damme's own reach, where all that power folded around empty air and became useless. And then Bruce Lee's open palm rested flat against Van Damme's solar plexus, at the soft place beneath the ribs where no amount of training provides protection. Not struck, placed, with the calm, specific, unhurried accuracy of a man making a point in a language he has spoken his entire life. He said, quite enough that Dangerfield behind the desk had to lean forward to catch it. If I wanted this to be a fight, it would already be over. You came here tonight to prove I couldn't do this. Now you know I chose not to. Van Damme did not move for 5 full seconds. The man who had stood up 60 seconds ago to expose Bruce Lee as a fraud in front of 23 million people stood perfectly still with an open palm resting against his ribs and felt for the first time in his professional life the specific and devastating weight of being shown mercy by the person he came to destroy. Rodney Dangerfield rose from behind his desk. Slowly. He did not speak. He simply stood and began to applaud. One pair of hands in a silent studio. And then the front row followed. And then the whole room in the low, rolling, uncertain wave of people who have just witnessed something they cannot categorize and are using their hands because they have run out of language. Van Damme sat back down quietly. He picked up his jacket from the arm of the couch and said something low, not for the microphone, not for the cameras, not for the 23 million people at home. 4 words aimed at no one in particular and everyone at once. I was wrong today. This is why Bruce Lee is not just a martial arts legend. He is something else entirely. Subscribe right now. The final 2 sections are the ones nobody ever tells. The stage lights went down at 10:47 p.m. The audience filed out through the double doors at the back of the studio, still talking in the low, unresolved way of people who witnessed something they have not yet finished processing. The cameras were covered. The crew moved through their closing routine with the efficient silence of people paid not to have opinions about what just happened on the stage they were now dismantling. Van Damme was alone in the corridor behind the stage, jacket in hand, not pacing, not on the phone, just standing with his back against the wall, and the particular stillness of a man whose body has run out of performance and has nothing left underneath it but the truth. A producer approached him, started to say something about the segment, about certain portions that may need to be reviewed before the broadcast aired. Van Damme looked at him once, and the producer found somewhere else to be. Then Bruce Lee came through the corridor, moving with the same unhurried ease he had carried onto that stage and off it. No publicist, no conversation. A man who went to work, finished his work, and was going home. He would have walked past. He had every reason to walk past. He stopped, looked at Van Damme for a moment, then sat down on the bench beside him, without being invited, without saying anything, and without any indication that he found the situation unusual in any way. They sat in silence for longer than 2 men who had just done what they did on national television should have been able to sit in silence. Then Van Damme said it, quietly, without looking up. How long did it take you to get to where you don't need to prove it? Bruce Lee considered the question the way you consider something no one has ever asked you, even though you have known the answer for years. But someone else in that corridor heard every word, and what that person carried out of the building that night is the reason this story survived at all. His name was Marcus Webb, 22 years old, 3rd week on the job at NBC Studios as a lighting technician. He had been in that corridor the entire time, finishing a cable check against the far wall, invisible in the way that young men in technical crews are always invisible to the people whose names are on the marquee. He wrote the exchange down that same night in a spiral notebook he kept in his back pocket, word for word, not because he was a journalist, not because he thought anyone would ever ask, but because he had grown up without a father, and something in what he had just overheard between those 2 men felt like the answer to a question he had been carrying since childhood, without knowing what the question was. In 1994, a journalist interviewing Van Damme for a French magazine asked him about Bruce Lee. Van Damme paused, longer than he paused for anything else in that interview, then said, "That man showed me something I spent 15 years trying to prove I didn't need. The day I finally accepted it, I became a better fighter and a better person." Then he moved on. The journalist moved on. The magazine ran the quote in the fourth paragraph, and nobody noticed. But Marcus Webb noticed. He still had the notebook. The greatest fighters in history never proved themselves by accepting every challenge. They proved themselves by choosing which ones deserved an answer, and which ones deserved only silence, and an open palm, and the quiet mercy of a man who could have ended it, and chose not to. Bruce Lee walked out of NBC studios that night without a trophy, without a headline, and without a single backward glance. Van Damme walked out carrying something that would take him 15 years to put down. That is the only difference that ever mattered. If this story moved you, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, who won that night? The man who challenged, or the man who chose mercy? Every single comment gets read. See you in the next one.